Today we're going to start talking about React. And React is going to be what we're going to build our front end in. So let's start with talking about a series of principles. Now, it can be seen. One sec. Okay. No signal. Nope. No. Okay, so let's talk about React. And React is going to be a component-based framework. Now, in order to React actually has a rather complicated building cycle because React is going to use a couple of features which are not present in regular JavaScript. And most notably, it's going to use something which is called JSX. And JSX is going to be a language which is going to allow me to, instead of declaring tags as strings or just creating them manually with JavaScript objects, to have a declarative syntax through which to express HTML structure. We're going to see this in a moment. Now, in order to use React, we're going to have to install it, and this is going to be a global utility. I'm not connected to the internet right now, but if I'd want to install it, obviously I already have it installed, I'd run npm install create React app, and I'm going to say -g from -global. Now this is not going to work because since I'm installing something globally, I'm going to have to do it as root. Right. This is going to install my my React utility, and if I look on my system, I'm going to have create React app. And create React app is going to be a little utility for which to just pass it a name for my new app, and it's going to download everything and build the app. Now we're going to look at a basic app shortly. However, let's see. Let me go to desktop because that's where I put this stuff. Right. So I just said create React app frontend, and it did this stuff. Right? It created this thing. Let's see what actually created here. So first of all, if I look at my package.json, my package.json is going to be a bit more complex than what we're used to, because we've basically used package.json just for dependency management until now. But actually, it knows something more, which is it knows to run certain things, which are scripts, corresponding to stages in the development of a product. Right. So start is just going to start my React app. I'm going to see what that does immediately. Build. Well, when I'm talking about build, I'm going to have to take into account the fact that, like I said, React isn't actually written in regular JavaScript, right? It's written in something else. And to see the difference, let's just look at a thing. This is not what it's supposed to be, but let's look at the class. It's going to look like this, right? And you see that this kind of syntax doesn't really look like JavaScript. It looks like something else. It allows me to define something which is HTML-like within JavaScript, which means that this is not going to be directly interpretable by the browser. And since it's not going to be directly interpretable by the browser, it's going to have to be transpiled. So it's going to have to be transformed into regular JavaScript. Let me just see if I have the right thing here. One sec. Maybe not. And I don't have the required internet. One sec. Let me just try to fix this. Okay, so to continue. So what's been created here is a certain template for an application. What's going to happen is that if I run, let me just find this one. If I run npm start, right? It's going to start a development server, and it's actually going to show my application in a browser window. And it's going to look somewhat like this. One sec. I still have something which I shouldn't. Okay. Right. It sort of looks like this. And this is my basic React app. Now I can actually explore this application via something which is called React Tools, which is going to be, if I've installed in the browser, if I just hit F12, I'm going to be able to select React here, and it's going to show me the component structure. Okay. Now, what I mean by component structure is that React is going to be organized in a component tree, and my main component is going to be app. Now, how did we get to app? Let's see. Well, I've had this public folder, and in this public folder, I have an index.html. This is the single page in the single page app model, right? And what's going to happen is that React is going to find this div, and it's going to take my component structure and put it as a child of this particular div. Now, where does this happen? If I look at index.js, I can see that it's React DOM render, and it's app, and right in document getelement by ID of root. Well, this parameter though seems a bit strange. Right? It's something I've never seen in a JavaScript function. And this is the JSX part. This is the fact that I can, instead of writing a string and manipulating things harder, I'm going to just be able to write a particular tag. And this is the extension that React covers. Now, this is the extension that React covers, but it actually has a couple more features. The fact of the matter being that JavaScript is a language whose standards are dynamically implemented, which means if another standard appears tomorrow, some of the features will be implemented tomorrow and some of the features will be implemented in a year. Now, since React isn't actually written in plain old JavaScript, React actually contains features which exist in the language standard, but which have not been yet implemented. Which means that actually React syntax in certain respects looks more like modern JavaScript than what we've written until now. Make sense? That's because I'm not held by the fact that the JavaScript engine has those features. Transpilation itself is going to consist in taking my React code and transforming it into JavaScript that the browser can understand. When it comes to JSX, the browser will never understand JSX unless it becomes part of the standard. However, when it comes to things like this, see the statement, the browser will probably not understand this syntax at this point because this is part of the standard, when at some point it's going to be integrated in the JavaScript engine. For example, in our version of Node, we can't use this at this point, and we've done stuff with require. So what the transpiler is going to do is take something which is not supported and transform it into something with require, something which is supported. But I'm going to have code which is future-proof. At some point in the future, my code is going to be consistent with the machine without transpilation. Understand what I'm saying? Right? So the machine has not implemented it yet, but I can pretend it did. Okay, now as to development, right? My application is going to be reloaded when I do something here. So let's do something. Let's go to our app.js and say this will be our app. Right, and if I go back to the browser, it appeared here. Okay. Now we've seen that what JSX means. However, JSX is going to contain a couple more things, which is going to be the fact that I can mix this kind of code with evaluated JavaScript code. And if I want evaluated JavaScript code, I'm just going to have a pair of curly brackets. Right? And this, for example, will be evaluated. This is pointless to evaluate, but we're going to see a more complex example as we proceed. Now, there's actually a React syntax, which is well, different from this one. You see that the syntax we're using is based on the class syntax for declaring objects. But there's actually something a syntax which doesn't use this, nor does it use JSX, and we could write in that syntax, but it would be much less productive. Now, if I look at my app, I can see that it has a render method. But it has a series of methods which are predefined and which define what it means to be a component. I can see that my app extends component, where component is something from React. Now, one of the methods, and the only necessary method, is going to be render. What render is going to do is going to transform this part into something which can be passed to the browser for drawing. So it's going to transform into a subtree, which is a DOM subtree, and which can be attached in a point of the my single page. Okay, now React would be useless if I just had this. So I'm going to have the possibility to split things further into components, because the way I'm going to think about a React application is going to be starting from a component structure. So I'm going to think, okay, what must the user interact with? How would I organize this in a hierarchy of components? And then I'm going to think, what state should each component have and how they interact? Well, let's create a component. Now, my component is going to be a separate module, and I already have a hint on how a separate module would work. If I look at this, right? This looks familiar if I think about how we created node modules. Right? Our node modules, though, exported things via a different syntax. So they had a module export. Now, like I said, what we're seeing here is something which will exist in the JavaScript implementations because it's part of the standard. And what's happening here is when we're saying export default app, it's similar to when we created a node module and we just exported the constructor for something. Right? We're exporting the default thing. So when we're importing React, right, import something from React, we're actually importing the default thing. So let's create our component, and my first thing is going to be my component. Right. Now, obviously, our application is no longer going to work right now, right, because we have not yet defined our component. So let's define our component. Our component should be defined in a separate JavaScript file. And this would be my component.js. This is going to look very similar to app. So let's just take this and adapt it. So this part does not apply. This part does not apply. It's going to be class my component. It's going to export my component. And let's say in the render thing, we're just going to say a custom component. Okay, and what's left to do is actually make this component available in app by importing it. And then I'm going to say import dot slash my component. Okay, and if I look here, my component is not defined. Okay. Okay, my component. Well, it should be defined. What did we do wrong? Okay, app.js. Oh, we've written something wrong. So it's import my component from my component. Right, let me set the custom component. Right, so that's how I would enter a component. Now the next interesting point is that my components so my application is going to be a tree of such components. And the way render is going to work is if I think about it, when I want to render the app, I'm going to get to this point, and in order to render this, I'm going to have to render my component, and then in order to render my component, I'm going to render its descendants and so forth. And when I get to the top, I'm going to have something which is purely HTML. Now, components have to communicate between each other because think about it like this. For example, an app contains two components, a list of widgets and the form to add a widget. And if I contain these two components, probably the list to communicate to the server for widget-based operations, to the RESTful service behind, is going to be in the app itself, which means I'm going to have to send both data and behavior to my children. Because if I have a list of components, I have to give it a list of things to display. Conversely, if I want that particular child component to be able to add something to which it does not know the rule for addition, doesn't know how to add it, I'm going to give it pass it the behavior that will allow it to do so. Now, something else. Apart from sending things via properties, I'm going to, let's send something via property so we understand. So it's my component, and we're going to say content is something, right? And the something is going to be, let's keep it in application state. So let's say this has a constructor of properties. It calls the parent constructor, and it says this.state, and let's call it for child is some content. Right. The state is going to allow any of my components to keep some internal state. The reason being that in this I can play with my own state, of course. But if, for example, I send something via a property to my child, they're not going to have something mutable. Right? They're going to have something which is constant. It can't be modified. So if they want to play around with it, they're going to have to save it in their own state and then do whatever modifications are necessary. So obviously my component, a custom component showing this.props.content. Right. And the difference is going to be, this part is shown as is, while this part is going to have to be evaluated. It's going to be evaluated to a string in this case. It's just going to be something which is going to be directly shown. And see, a custom component showing some content. So this is how I'd send stuff to my children. By the same mechanism, I'd be able to send to my children behavior. So I'd be able to, instead of sending some string, send some method of some sort. Send a function which they would call if they wanted to do a certain operation they don't know how to do. We're going to see this in shortly. So properties are immutable, and state is rather difficult to manipulate. The idea is that a component can maintain internal state. It can read from it directly, but it cannot write to it directly. And we're going to see that in order to write to the state, the component is going to have to use a particular method, which is going to be setState. So it's going to be this.setState. SetState is going to allow me to replace one or more keys from the state. Now, setState is actually going to be done asynchronously, so I can't rely on the time when it's done. React is going to do some optimization here. Now, what's going to happen when a component is created? So we can transform this into a more general discussion and ask ourselves, what is the general life cycle of a component? So a component is created, it is attached to the DOM, and then at a particular point later, its properties might be updated, might be changed by its parent, and then at a particular point, it might be detached from the DOM, so it might be removed, and it might run into an error. And I have a series of methods which are going to be called. Now these methods are named in a suggestive fashion. So if the method contains will, it is called before that particular point. So I have a method which is called component will mount. And this is called before I mount the component. Now, I have the pair of this is going to be component did mount. And whatever contains did is going to be called after the particular stage occurred. Now, if I have a method which contains should is going to be something which decides if a particular thing happens. So if I say something like should component update, this is going to be something which is either returns true or false, which is going to tell me if under certain circumstances the component should update or it should not update. When I create a component, what I'm going to have called is the constructor of the component, and we can see a constructor here. All right, let's look at our app component. Right, it has a constructor, which is part of the class syntax. Then it is going to be component will mount because it's been created, and the next step is going to be to attach it to the DOM. Then it's going to be rendered, so I know what is to be attached. And then I have component did mount. When I'm modifying properties, I'm going to have component will receive props, right, which is something which will happen in the future. Then I'm going to have should component update. So I've received props, should I do anything about it? Then component will update, because I should have updated, render, and component did update. And they're named in such a fashion that it's somewhat intuitive. When I take a component, I remove it from the DOM. It's component will unmount. This doesn't have a pair method, because if it's already happened, it's no longer my concern. Right? The component is outside the DOM, so I'm no longer concerned with it. And then, in case of error, I'm going to have a component did catch. Now, in order to see this a bit more clearly, let's start creating a minimal application. Then this is going to have a backend, which is going to be a RESTful backend. Let's just copy it here. And this is going to be extremely similar to the backends we've created before. I'm just copying them because I don't have, I'm not connected to the internet. I'm just going to get the dependencies. One sec. Right. So I now have two folders here. One is backend, one is frontend. My backend is going to be a really simple service. Right? It's going to be something which connects to my database through SQLite. It has an author, which just has a name and an email. Let's ignore this part for now. And then it creates the tables, it finds authors, it gets authors, and so forth. It's the service we've written for the tutorials, basically. Now, what we might do when we want to send the application, to give the client access to the application, is we might deliver the final form of the application through a static content, right, after we've built it, and we get the final form. Or we might do something else. Since we want to develop in the fashion that we've already started in, right, by seeing changes dynamically and so forth, we're going to serve our server for now from as a different application. And since it's a different application, we're going to have to tell it to allow requests from a different server. Right? Because by default, a server is not going to allow cross-origin requests, so requests coming from somewhere else. And in order for it to allow this, we've added for each of our responses a couple of headers. And these headers are standard. And we could do it like this, or we could use a middleware, which is called CORS. And CORS would handle this. We can just install it as just another dependency and register it with use. But in this case, we've just put the headers manually, so we see what they're about. So it's allow origin, any origin, right? Allow headers, what headers to accept, and allow methods, what methods to accept. Make sense? So otherwise, my server would refuse to give responses to a request coming from a different source. So we can actually run our server. So let's go there. We'll just run it, and it's just going to sit in memory. And now we want to transform. We're going to ignore our server. Like I said, it doesn't contain anything special. And we're going to ignore it and just focus on our front end. So we have an author list. And let's display our author list. Right. And in order to display our author list, we're going to ignore this my component and create a new one. And let's say we're going to create a component which is going to be called author list.js. And to see the stages, we're just going to write it for now, and it's going to be import React and component from React. Right, it's going to be a class which extends component. Right, and this is going to have a render of some sort. And let's say it renders something which looks like this. Div. So I will be the author list at some point. Right. Let's replace my component with this. This is no longer relevant for us. So we're going to have our author list. Okay, and they should. Oh, we've forgotten to export it, so it's going to be exported, just like before, and it should appear here now. I forgot something else. Oh, we forgot to import it, I think. Yes, we did. So let's import author list from author list. Okay, so that's all right. I will be the author list at some point. But now we're confronted with something else, which is we actually need the author list from somewhere, from the server. And we could do this particular logic in the application itself, but it would be better to actually create some special files, some special modules, which are going to handle communication with the server. So we want to have an author store. And this would allow us, if we feel we need that, to do, let's say, without involving logic in the component itself, stuff like caching. Right? If, for example, I can't get the results at some point, I might have them cached and so forth. So let's create our author store. Let's create a folder which is we're going to call stores. Okay, and here we're going to have an author store here. Right, and we need a couple of more things. So first off, we're going to have to communicate with the server. So let's have a constant for the server, which is going to be on localhost in this case. And our store is going to be a class, and it's going to have a series of methods. Let's say it's going to have getAll for now, and it's going to have create one of author, whatever that means. We're going to add this. But now, if I look at getAll, I need something else. First off, I need something with which to do requests, right? Which should be somewhat elegant, and we're going to use Axios because we've used it in the past. So we're going to say import Axios. Obviously, this is a dependency, and we should install it with npm install. And for getAll, we'd have something like Axios of server authors. And then we get a response. Let me just make this a bit more compact. So this is going to be promise-based, so then we get a response. And, well, let's say we keep our state. So we're going to have a constructor here. And in the constructor, we're going to say this.content is the array of authors. And here we're going to say this.content is response.data. Everything seems to be all right. The problem is that we, let's also put a catch here, which is just going to write the error to the console. The problem is that we want to notify. The best way of doing this, in order to hide everything, is we would want to notify whoever asked us to get all the authors of the fact that the authors have been received. And we can do this, or the preferred manner of doing this is by using something which is which handles events. And actually, we have something which is should be pre-installed. Let's look at it. It's going to be a Facebook emitter. Well, we're going to get it from somewhere. The point is, we're going to need a mechanism to send an event. And let's assume that we've received this something from outside. We've saved it in a local property. And when we got the content, we're just going to say this emitter emit author load. So this is going to be the equivalent of an event, which is going to be relatively lightweight. Okay, so we need Axios and we need event emitter. So one sec, so I just get them from somewhere else. Oh, this may take a while. Okay, so copying files. Okay, so what might I do now? If I go to my author list.js, I might now use my store. Right. So we're going to say here, let's say the store refers to this, so it's going to have const store is new author store. Obviously, I need this one, so I'm going to have to import it. So import author store from stores author store, right? Because it's here. And if I look at the constructor for author store, it actually wants an emitter. It wants something which emits events. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to have import event emitter from Facebook emitter, so FB emitter. So now we're going to be able to create it and send it as a parameter to our store, so we can communicate with it. All right, so the first time our component is going to mount, to be attached to the DOM, we want to get whatever is in the store, right? We want to get the list of authors so we can show it. So we're going to add something here. We're going to say component did mount, and we're going to say store.getAll. However, we don't actually know when the store is going to finish its operation. So we're going to say emitter.addListener on author load, which is what our emitter knows how to emit now. And when we got that, we're going to modify our state. And I said, first of all, that I can't modify my state directly. But for now, I don't actually have a state. Let's add that. And we're going to say we have a constructor of props in case we receive props. And now we're going to say this.state is a list of key value pairs, and I'm going to have authors, which is initially going to be empty. And when I get author load, I'm going to update my state. This is going to be done like this. So I got something, and I'm going to say that when this happens, this.setState and in the author's key, we're going to say store.content. Okay, so when I create this component, first I'm going to call the constructor, which is going to put a key in state, which is not going to be populated with anything. Then when I try to attach it, I'm going to try to get everything from the store. The store is going to start getting stuff from the server. When it receives the answer from the server, it's going to notify me. So I can get it from the store content and presumably display it. Because for now, we don't have the display part. Okay, let's have the display part. Well, what I might do is go here, where I said I would be the author list, and display everything directly. Let's do this. So the way I could display everything directly, well, I'm going to need a line or a list item or a div or something for each of my authors from the server. Right? I'm going to need a separate component for each author. So the way I'm going to do it is by using a map. So I'm going to say this.state.authors.map. And map is going to receive something of an author. And it's going to draw that particular author. Let's say for now it's a div. And in this div, I'm going to have the author. Now, what's going to happen though, is if I leave it like this is not going to work. It's not going to get executed. Because this is going to be interpreted as plain text. If I want it to be executed, I have to put it between curly braces, so it's evaluated. Okay, so now it's evaluated, and in this case, I'm going to have to write here. I can alternate between tags and JavaScript code. And right now, I'm going to want to evaluate author.name, and let's say a space author.email. Okay, and what this should do is make a request to the server, get whatever authors, and I have some test authors inserted there. So get whatever authors are in the database and draw them here. Now to see what authors I do have in the database, I can actually go to localhost on 8080 authors. And I'm going to see a list of things. Like I said, a list of test values. Now I forgot to do something, which is, and it gives me an error, which is, I can only do something after I've called super or props in this case. Right, it tells me that author store doesn't actually export what's supposed to export, and indeed this is the case. There's no export in author store. So export default author store. Okay. So now it's going to work. I do have a couple of invalid things which are from more distant past, but I obviously have my authors. So that's we've relatively simply connected our author to our backend. Now, in order to have something which is somewhat testable, we should have the ability to add an author from our application. And this is going to translate to some form of some sort. So let's, first of all, we're going to need some logic here. And our logic is going to be, assuming we've received an author, is going to be axios.post, I think. One sec. Okay, so it's going to be at server authors. Don't necessarily know if this will work, but we'll fix it if it doesn't. And then, if I get a response, I'm just going to reload everything. Right, so if I get a response, I'm going to say this.getAll. Axios is doing HTTP requests. The idea is that traditionally HTTP requests have been done via unnecessarily complicated interface. which is an object which is called XML HTTP request. Which if we try to use that, would be tempted to actually wrap it in our own library, because it's, like I said, unnecessarily hard to use. And this actually has been addressed, and there's a new API which is called the Fetch API, but which is not uniformly implemented yet. So so this is a third-party library which does HTTP requests in a fashion that allows us to just write 3 lines instead of writing, something more complex. And the catch, we're going to just catch the thing. Okay, so we have our server logic done. Let's go back to author list and see what we can do here. So what we could do is create a form. Right. Let's leave our thing in div and create a parent div, so we group everything nicely. Let's move this here, and let's have a little form. Right. And here we're going to have a form. So we're going to say name. We're not going to be really civilized about how we add it. So we have an input text, which is going to be for name, and we have an input text which is going to be for email. And obviously we're going to need a button. Alright, so input type button value add. Right. So we have our little form, but it's not actually connected to anything. Right? It's not. It doesn't do anything. The first thing, we should have something on the button, which is going to be an on-click. And again, we're probably going to have something evaluated. So we don't actually have anything here, so let's define a method. So we're going to have add author of author. And this is going to actually do server dot one sec. This is going to be we can put it outside. So we're going to say let add author is something of author. And this is going to do store dot save one dot add one of author, right? Which is something which the store supports. Create one, sorry. Create one of author. And since the store, after it creates something, is going to reload everything and notify me, I'm going to reload everything in the state. Okay, so we have this one. Now, our problem here, though, is what are we adding? Right? We've got nothing to send to our method. So if we'd want to send something here, we have to have an author, right? Where do we get the author from? Well, the answer is going to be that we're going to get it from the state. So let's say that the state contains an author name, which is initially going to be an empty string, and an author email, which is initially going to be an empty string. Now, obviously, this will not suffice. So we have to update, under certain circumstances, we have to update the state. Okay, so let's do that first. So we can update the state from here. So we're going to have something which is on change, something. Okay, and this one is also going to be on change. Now, something to notice is that for any such event handler, I'm going to have to pass a function which is going to have what prototype? It's going to be a function of event. Right? Any event handler is going to be a function of event. And in this case, it actually suits me. But in this case, it's not going to. So let's say it's going to be this dot handle change. All right. which will does not yet exist, but we're going to create it shortly. Now, I've put the same method, the same handler function in both onChanges. So what I could do here is have a different function for each of my input fields. But this would be excessive. We maybe need something a bit smarter, right? Something which can handle the change on any input. So how am I going to identify the particular input? Well, I'm going to name them. Let's name them. So let's say this is this is author name, and this is author email. Right? Okay, so we're now ready to write handle change. Well, handle change, let's just write it here. Handle change is going to be a method of event. I'm going to have, let's first write it in a more naive fashion. Let's say we have a target, which is going to be event.target. So this is going to be where the event was emitted. In this case, it's going to be the particular input. And we know that since it's an input, it has a value. And since we've written them like this, it has a name. And what we can do is update the state like this. This.setState this.setState, and we can use calculated properties, and we've already encountered calculated properties. So we're going to have the property with the name contained in the name variable is value. Okay, so this is actually whenever something changes in one of these inputs, it's going to update the respective property, and the respective property is going to have the same name as this. Okay, so on-click. Now, on-click, we can't just serve it a function like we did here. This is not going to work because on-click we actually want to run a function, which is a function of author, not a function of event. And we can actually write a little arrow function here. And this is going to be this.add. It's not this, it's just add author. Add author of something which is author-like. And we're just going to create it here. It's going to be name is this.state.name. And email is this.state.email. Right, and everything is going to happen. Now this is actually not going to work, but for a bit of a stranger reason than we'd imagine. Let's see it not working first. All right. Cannot read property set state of undefined. Now, this is a rather stranger characteristic, which is the fact that in JavaScript, if you just write a function which is not connected to anything, and inside the function, we do a console warn of this. This is going to exist. And the reason is that functions defined with function are going to take this that's enclosing them. So they're going to have this object, which is the object from the particular point where they're called. This is translated into, in JavaScript by default, functions are not bound. So they're not bound to a particular object. And when we looked over JavaScript objects, we saw that we can disconnect a function from an object, call it on a different object, and so forth. We can play around with functions however we want. But this has the defect that when we call it here, this is not going to be our component. So we have two solutions for this. The first one is to manually bind the function, which ensures that subsequently when it's called in relation to a particular object. And let's do this first. So it's going to be this.handleChange is this.handleChange.bind of this. This sort of syntax, whenever I call handle change, is going to be bound to the component, and we're out of trouble. However, the sort of syntax we're using here doesn't really look all that elegant. And we have a different solution, which is the fact that while functions defined with function have this behavior, arrow functions don't have this behavior. In the regular language, though, we can't actually use the constructor as we'd use a constructor function without the class syntax. So we can't actually define an arrow function here. However, in React we can. And we're going to do that shortly, but let's see it work first. All right, so some author, some email. We have no validators, no nothing. Okay, so that didn't work. I can close this one. Let's see what we did wrong. We've missed something. So author name, author email, and change this handle change. Okay. Author name, author email. One sec. Let's fix this. Okay. Our error actually comes from Axios. Let's change this. There's a thing. Instead of doing this, it doesn't set headers correctly. So in order to make it work, we're going to pass it a configuration object, and the configuration object is going to look like this. Method post, I think. URL is going to be the same URL as here. Data is going to be author. And the problem we're having is that it actually didn't set the right headers. There should be a workaround, but we're not going to find it now. So headers is going to be, and we're going to just give it a header manually. Content type, application JSON. Okay, so that should work. Let's see if it does. No? Okay. So let's check it out. So we've not actually sent anything in the request. So let's see if okay, let's take this out. Let's see if the actual method receives what it's supposed to receive. So for create one, we're going to say console warn author. Okay. Try again. Oh. Okay. Console. Undefined. We've not sent it what's supposed to be sent. Why wouldn't we have done that? So author, name, and email. So this.state.name and this.state.email. Oh, that's because we didn't call them like that. It's this.state.name, author name, and this.state.author email. So let's check out if this actually works with just post. So it's post with this thing. Author. Okay, so it works. Okay, so let's do a bit of refactoring before continuing. So first off, we can write this simpler. Instead of writing all this part, we can actually say set state of event target name, because that evaluated the same thing, is event target value. And we can actually avoid doing this. However, what we're doing here is rather non-standard, which is we can define this as an arrow function directly in the constructor. Because I said that arrow functions are well behaved as opposed to regular functions. We're going to say this.handle change is an arrow function. Right. So let's see if it's still working. Right, so some test. It's still working. And we have it a bit more elegant. Okay. Do you have any questions until now? Does it seem relatively clear? So the logic is this. What? Sure. So the logic of the thing is this. I have a component hierarchy. Now, if I have a component hierarchy, what's going to be my challenge is how do I send data downwards in the component hierarchy, and how do I send behavior? Now, I have to send data because otherwise I wouldn't be able to delegate. What my application has to do, for example, is having a list of authors, give it to a component which knows how to handle a list of authors. Right? Or, if I have a list of authors, for each author, give the author to a component which knows how to handle an author. Right? So I have to send it data. And the way I send data is via props. Right? And I can see props here, not here. I can see props. I'm going to be able to see props. The way I'm going to handle stuff is via props. And the way I'm going to handle okay, let's modify this a bit to showcase what I'm saying. So let's say instead of having the logic to handle the author store on the author list, let's say we want to move it on the app. It doesn't make much sense in our situation, but let's say for some reason we want to do that. How would we do that? Well, author list would have to receive a list of authors to display. Right? So let's try to make these changes and see how that would go. In fact, no. Let's do something else. Let's modify this so it doesn't. So it's no longer just a string, but it's a separate component. Let's say, which we want to do in the future, that what we want to do is have each row have two states, right? Like editable table rows. I click a button and it transforms to something else. And if we start writing stuff with if here, it's going to become really complicated. And we decide that in order to simplify it, we're going to make a special component. How would that special component look? Well, it would be something which would be called author. And it would get let's say, it has a thing which is author, and it would get a particular author to display. Right? So I no longer know how to display a particular author, so I'm going to send it downwards. Okay, so how would the author look like? Let's import it. It's going to need to be imported at some point. and it's going to be a separate file. Sorry, it's not a recap, but it's a clarification. It's simpler like that. Right, and this is going to be a component like all the components we've already seen. We can actually start from one of these and copy paste it, or we can write it. It's actually author.js. So it's going to be, one sec, so you actually see the syntax. So import React component, just like any other component from React. Class author list, class author. Export default author. Right, so this is the general form of such a module. Okay, and here I'm going to have some render. And the render is going to return, something. And let's say it's a div. And it says basically what we had before. So I know that I've received in a property something which is called author. I'm going to say this.props.author.name. Let's say a space. And then I'm going to have, no, not plus. I can just write them with space like this. So this.props.author.email. Okay? So I've delegated showing on author to a separate component. And this is how I send stuff downwards via the component tree. Let's look at this again. So for each of my authors that I get from the server, I'm going to delegate the current author to one of these components. Okay, so let's see if it still works. Oh, it sort of doesn't because it's confused. It's because we named that wrong. No such file to open. Okay. One sec. It's going to be live in a sec. Right. And so it still works. Now, obviously, for my case, it wouldn't be that useful, but for a different case, it would be. Right? It's let's see a different case. Let's say that my author actually has two particular states. Let's go to author, and what's going to happen is that this is JavaScript code. Return something something. So let's say that in my constructor, I actually had in my state something which tells me what mode I'm in, because each row can be in editing mode or in viewing mode for some reason. So I'm going to say is editing, and I start with false. So in order to complicate our logic a bit, we're going to say if not is editing, it's this stuff, which we already had. Else, so if it is editing, we're going to just have a return, and let's just return a text or something. It's a div, which just says, I am not supported yet. Right? So we now have in order to see how this would work, we now have we can now have a button. Let's have a button here, which switches modes. So I have a button which says go to editing and a button which says go back. And we're just going to write it here. So on click, This is going to be this is going to be execute this dot set state is editing true. And let's just copy paste this one because it's going to be the same button with false. In the I'm not supported, so you can just go back. Right, it's editing false. And I'm saying cancel. Right, so I can see that my component code is getting a bit more complicated, and this justifies the fact that I've extracted this part as a separate component. Let's see here. Is editing is not defined. Okay, why is it not defined? One sec. Oh, is editing is false, correct. So where did I get my, oh yeah. Here is the error is this. If this dot not this dot is editing. Okay, so I can now, I've made another mistake. Okay, so on click is this thing. Oh, I've deleted it at some point. Let's see what's happening. So, oh yeah, is this dot state dot is editing. Right? So now it does this thing. So that's how internal state would look like. Now, unfortunately, I think we're going to stop and continue next time from this point because we actually want to build the complete thing. And we're going to go through this stuff with the tutorials too. So we're going to create a simple React application,